Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the Campfire Chat organized by the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative on the topic of solar radiation modification and the Arctic. We have today 4 experts, guest speakers with us to share their experience and, more importantly, their different perspectives on these issues. I will ask them in a moment to introduce themselves. But just to remind ourselves, this is meant to be a discussion around a virtual campfire. There'll be no speeches, no slideshows, discussion. And hopefully toward the second part of the session, we'll be able to open for question and answers with the participants. So to start, let me introduce myself. My name is Janos Pasztor. I'm the Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. I've been doing this since 2016. Before that, I worked in the UN. My last position was Assistant Secretary General for Climate Change. And before that, I worked in various UN and non-governmental organizations as well, including the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNEP, WWF, and so on and so forth. So I've been working basically on the issue of climate change and sustainable development for the last 4 decades. And obviously, the results are not very good, so we haven't done a good enough job. And I owe to my grandchildren the unfinished business of completing or trying to do as much as we can to do better on climate change. So with that, can I ask my colleagues to introduce themselves? Shawna, Larson, please, you have the, go ahead.
I'm Shawna Larson. I'm Sukhbia on my mom's side from the village of Port Graham, and I'm Atna on my dad's side from the village of Chickalhoun, located in Alaska. And I serve as the vice chairwoman of the Tribal Council for Chickalhoun Village, and I also am the deputy director at Native Movement. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Durwood, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, Durwood Zelke. I'm an international environmental lawyer heading a group called the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. Like Janos, I have failed for the last 40 years in my effort to slow down climate change sufficiently, with a few victories along the way to still give us optimism and hope that we can do better, including helping turn the Montreal Protocol into a treaty that not only focuses on protecting stratospheric ozone, but also the climate system. I spent several wonderful years in Alaska, Shawna, working principally for the Tlingit Indians in Southwest. So great to be on a program with you.
Thank you. Helene?
Yes, well, thank you. I'm Helene Murray. I'm a senior researcher at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in the near Arctic of Trondheim. So my background is in natural sciences, and in my daily work, I work with different industries on looking at how to cut emissions. So primarily, I'm working with shipping, but also a bit with aviation. But I've also been engaged with the geoengineering community for almost a decade, since about 2011 now, working on both solar radiation management and carbon dioxide removal. So I do some Earth system modeling for both the GeoMIP, so geoengineering modeling comparison project, as well as CDR. Also, I'm a scientific advisor on the Decimals project. So this is funded by SRMGI and really enables more voices to come to the table and expressing their thoughts and finding opportunities to look into how SRM in particular would, what that would mean for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. And Brad, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, good day, everyone. My name is Brad Ack, and I am currently serving as the Executive Director of Ocean Visions, which is a consortium of research and academic institutions in the United States dedicated to transforming the knowledge and capacity from these institutions into ocean solutions. I have a 30-year or so career also failing to protect the environment and a living planet. So I joined my colleagues in recognizing that we have not been successful, and this is deeply disturbing and actually dangerous for all of us and for our kids and grandkids. So I've spent 10 years with WWF. I worked with the Marine Stewardship Council for 6. I led the Puget Sound recovery effort in the state of Washington for 5 years, and have had a few other odd jobs in the environmental movement here and there. The specter of climate change has been paramount throughout all of that and growing ever larger throughout that entire trajectory until my final stint at World Wildlife Fund, where I left a year ago and had responsibility for our Arctic program. And that completely changed my mind about how inadequate our climate response was. Stop there.
Thank you, Brad. So we have a great group tonight. Let me say a few words about us, the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. We're a foundation-funded initiative. We have 16 people working virtually, even before COVID, on 3 continents. And we have a very simple mission, is to catalyze the creation of effective governance for approaches that can alter the climate, in particular carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. We are impartial about the use or not of these technologies. We're not here to promote or to be against. What we're doing is we're raising the issues of governance, the governance challenges that would need to be considered by not just governments, but also various stakeholders in either making these things work well or deciding not to make use of these approaches in either way. We need governance frameworks within which we can do that. One part of our strategy, and an important part, is to encourage learning about these approaches through conversations like this one and many others that we have put together in the C2GLearn process, where we have now over 50 experts who have been working with us in the various webinars and campfire chats that we have been organizing. Now, the purpose of the campfire chats, it's important to highlight this, is to show the diversity of views, to have different views expressed by the different speakers, and not just to express the different views, but explain why they have different views on maybe the same issue, the same scientific fact. And of course, for that, we need a variety of speakers, and we try to the best of our ability to bring a variety of speakers to each topic. We aim for maximum diversity in terms of geography, gender, socio-political context. But of course, it's not possible to do that at every campfire chat because we can only have so many speakers. But I think on the whole, when we look at the totality of our C2GLearn activities, I think we've managed to get that diversity, even though still most of the work on these issues takes place in the global north. Not entirely. There are things that are happening, as Helen also mentioned, the decimals and other activities. So things are beginning to happen elsewhere. So anyway, the objective of the discussions here is not to come to a conclusion. It's not to convince one speaker or the other speaker about who is right and who is wrong, but is to exchange the experiences and demonstrate the different views. Of course, whatever views are expressed by our colleagues, those are their views and not necessarily those of C2G. Now, just a few words about the climate situation that we're in. I don't think we need to spend too much time because I think we probably all agree that we're in a crisis situation. The impacts are clear, not just in the Arctic, and we'll talk more about that, but elsewhere in the world. And even the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees was very clear that we must go and do very substantial emission reductions. The emission reductions must go into turbo mode. But even if we do that, we will still need to rely on carbon dioxide removal to make sure that we get the concentrations down. But some scientists also say that we need maybe also solar radiation modification. And the purpose of today is to discuss what that might look like in the Arctic. Not necessarily the discussion whether or not we need it, but if ever, then what would be the implications? Now, the Arctic, as we'll be hearing more about that, is really a little bit like the canary in the coal mine. And we don't have canaries, but we have polar bears, we have the Arctic ice, not a mine. But more importantly, we have people. We have people who live in the Arctic and who are who need the ice, who need the ecosystems that are now being hurt by the global heating. And we know that the warming of the Arctic is over twice the global average, and that's just the average. And we've seen how some extremes can be really, really serious. The ice is disappearing, and it gives us a double challenge because on the one hand, it has an immediate impact on the ecosystems, but at the same time, by lowering the albedo, there is even more heating to come. And then there is also another part of the problem is that there are economic opportunities that are provided by, at least short-term economic opportunities provided by the disappearing ice. So it's a complicated situation. And then there is solar radiation modification. To what extent could it help directly, indirectly, in or outside the Arctic, whether it's stratospheric aerosol injection or marine cloud brightening or even local surface albedo modifications. Just a word on terminology. We don't have to decide on what's the best terminology, but different people use different terminology. The broad topic is solar radiation modification, within which there is stratospheric aerosol injection, which some people call solar geoengineering, others call climate engineering. So there are different words. We just have to be clear about what we're referring to. Now, all of these issues bring up key governance challenges, and that is what we're going to be talking about now. What's happening? What are the issues? What are different intergovernmental and non-governmental, non-state actors doing about this? We cannot address all the issues in this campfire chat, but I hope that we will be able to address some of the most interesting and most pertinent issues. Now, the mechanics of the session, I will ask each of our guest speakers in a moment to one sort of starting question, and they will have 2 to 3 minutes to respond to that question. And then I hope to have encourage a discussion within the group, within the speakers, and they might ask each other questions. I might ask them some questions, but anyway, generally have a discussion in the group. In the meantime, while this is happening, I hope that the participants will start formulating questions. And when you do that, please put that under the Q&A tab of the Zoom functionality. You will see that there is a like button. So if you see a question that you like, please click on that, because that will raise it in priority. And if you have many questions, then obviously we may not have time to deal with all of them. And then we'll start with those that have more than one like. So please do that. There's also a chat function. You're welcome to chat, but if you have a question, please put it under the Q&A button. So with that, let's start now. And I would like to ask our speakers, as a first go, I would like to ask Durwood. You actually co-authored a paper recently with Mario Molina, who, as we know, recently died. And that's a big loss for all of us to have him go, but that's the way it goes. But anyway, you've co-authored a paper recently with him on the state of the Arctic. And maybe based on that paper and your knowledge, if you could give us a brief rundown on what is the latest situation in the Arctic, where are we, and where do we expect to be in the foreseeable future? Thank you.
Yes, I had the privilege of working extensively with Mario Molina, who passed away of a heart attack at age 77 earlier this month, in a terrible surprise and even a bigger loss to the climate community. We had written an article together in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences a decade ago laying out a fast mitigation set of strategies to slow warming. We did a second round with Professor Ramanathan at Scripps called Well Under 2, laying out these strategies in more detail. And we were in the process of updating the paper from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and which we will finish, but Mario won't be there for the celebration. We also did a series of op-eds to put some of this information out into the more general public sphere along the way to the more detailed scientific analysis. And the last one we did for Project Syndicate appeared after Mario passed away. And it was called The Ticking Time Bomb at the Top of the World. And it focused on where we were with the Arctic. So Ram and one of his colleagues, Pistoni and one other, had done a couple of papers on the Arctic to show what happens as we reduce the albedo. The first one was 2014, and it said we've lost 40% of Arctic sea ice from 1979 to 2011. And that's added about 25% as much warming as CO2 has added in that period. And then that team said, well, let's now look at what happens when we lose all of the summer sea ice, and that great white shield disappears. And that paper says when that happens, we'll add the equivalent of 1 trillion tons of CO2. That's on top of the 2.4 trillion we put in since pre-industrial times, equivalent to 56 parts per million of CO2 concentration being added. In the Arctic, the radiative forcing would add 22 watts per square meter. Average globally, it's 0.71. And it would advance the 2-degree target, which is too warm, of course, by 25 years. So when that happens, we are, to use a very precise scientific term, screwed, completely screwed, because the Arctic is key to so much of the global climate system. And that will, as we lose that sea ice, and you note, Janos, that we're warming the Arctic at twice the global rate. Well, actually, it's probably closer to 3 times, but it's at least twice, aiming towards 3, and going up constantly every year. So you lose the Arctic sea ice, as we're doing, and you start melting permafrost, what we used to call permanent frost, and now becomes another source, another feedback, releasing CO2, methane, and N2O. So this starts what Tim Lenton at Exeter, the most important scientist on feedbacks, calls, the wicked cascade of other feedbacks and tipping points. And we are incredibly close to losing control of the climate system, where we'll enter the hothouse Earth. We'll see impacts on the bottom 3 billion especially that'll be unmanageable and strain our governance system and break it. So back to the 1.5 report from the IPCC. They lay out 2 years ago this month the 3 key strategies to slowing down warming and staying below 1.5. The first is, slow down on CO2, and we're aiming for net zero at 2050. That's efficiency and clean energy. That's great. But as Mario and I point out, when you stop emitting fossil fuel CO2, you actually cause warming for the first decade. This is somewhat of a surprise, but you reduce the co-emitted sulfates, they fall out faster, leaving the residue of the CO2, and you unmask warming that's already in the system. This is bad news. You have to do CO2. No one disputes that. But it doesn't help you win the 10-year sprint that we have to win to save the Arctic, permafrost, and indeed the planet. So second is the short-lived climate pollutants. And that's where I spend most of my time. That includes the HFCs that we've done so well with under the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. By the way, the Montreal Protocol is the world's best environmental treaty. That's the climate treaty. it has not only solved the first great threat to the global atmosphere, stratospheric ozone loss, but at the same time, it has done more for climate. It has avoided warming that otherwise would equal CO2 today. It's a pretty outstanding job for this treaty. Then there's black carbon, particularly efficacious in the Arctic. You have methane and tropospheric ozone, okay? And then the third thing that IPCC 1.5 tells us is carbon dioxide removal, starting, of course, with the brilliant technology of photosynthesis, and then moving much further along. And then as insurance, this is what we're talking about today, solar radiation management. It would be unconscionable, indeed, it would be planetary malpractice not to speed up our solutions, number one. It's axiomatic, you can't solve an accelerating problem with slow-moving solutions, doesn't work. And then it would also be malpractice if we didn't get ready for deeper intervention with solar radiation management. Thank you.
We'll come to that, and I think you raised, thank you, Derwood, and you raised a number of issues that we may need to come back to in terms of Montreal Protocol and some of the short-lived pollutants. But let's move on for now. Time is of the essence here, but you've alluded to a little bit to what the global impacts would be of losing the Arctic. Maybe Brad, if I could ask you to go a little bit more in depth about why we need to save the Arctic. I mean, what's the issue?
Well, first, thank you, Derwood. That was a tremendous presentation in a very short amount of time about the incredible risk that we face from the changes that we've unlocked at the top of the planet. And, you know, it's kind of like the Pandora's box. I mean, the cause is now out of the box, and it's very hard to put it back in using at least traditional methods. And I completely agree with your statement that it is planetary malpractice to not be accelerating a different suite of solutions. And I look forward to having that conversation. You know, I think Derwood did a pretty good job of talking about the additive contribution to forced heating of the loss of sea ice, the additive contribution to greenhouse gas concentrations of the loss of permafrost. He didn't touch quite as much on land ice, but the amount of water trapped in the Greenland ice sheet, of which we've lost 4 trillion tons since 1992, has a measurable impact on the ocean. The global ocean, everybody on the planet depends on, has already had a measurable impact on sea levels, which affects coastal ecology and coastal communities, fisheries around the world. That water is in fact able to be seen from space in terms of a cold water blob in the North Atlantic that's affecting the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. Incredible, right? Which actually affects the weather in Northern Europe. And so that bizarre movie where that showed a rapid cooling in Northern Europe, I think it was called The Day After Tomorrow. Actually, there was some scientific coherence to that concept that while the rest of the world gets warmer, parts of Europe could actually get colder. The Arctic affects, we've seen great work from Jennifer Francis, affects the jet stream and the way that winds and weather patterns circulate around the globe, making the jet stream more wavy and leaving these stalled polar cold fronts in places as far south as Texas. While the North Pole is at record high temperatures, the Arctic affects monsoon patterns in places like India. And in fact, India has a robust research program in the Arctic. So I think what I said in my introduction was when I got to World Wildlife Fund and started being responsible for our program in the Arctic, that was when the switch clicked for me on the critical importance of climate and how far behind we are. And the presentation that Derwood just gave is really honestly not well understood by many people who lead our climate response. And I will start with the people who negotiated the 1.5, the Paris Agreement. We had a session with them shortly after that agreement was announced, and we had just written a paper between WWF and Columbia University called A 5-Degree Arctic and a 2-Degree World, which argued that the Paris Agreement was not good enough for the Arctic because of this Arctic amplification, and therefore the Paris Agreement wasn't good enough for the world because of all these feedback loops that were already mentioned. And honest to God, many of these negotiators did not have that information. They did not know about Arctic amplification. They did not realize that things like permafrost weren't modeled fully in the climate models. So we have a serious problem of just changing the dialogue, which I hope we'll talk about more here.
Thank you, Brad. And this business of the negotiators not understanding what some of the issues are. Let's hope that this kind of conversation can contribute to that problem as well. Let me come to Helen now, and maybe if you could share with us a few thoughts on, from your perspective, of which proposed SRM approaches could be, or maybe not, be relevant for the Arctic. And what would be their potential benefits, risks, and governance challenges? Obviously, we can talk a long time about this, but just the main possible options, if you could say a few words. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, we can talk for a very long time about this indeed, and I suspect that our conversations from today will continue for a long time after just this one campfire session. And of course, there are a lot of different options on the table, including the ones that target, the global climate, that would also cool the Arctic, but also the ones that target the Arctic directly. Of course, the Arctic sea ice has been mentioned. It's very key in regulating the global climate and also in modulating the weather in the middle latitudes in North America and in Europe and so on. So what happens in the Arctic is very important for climate and weather in many places. So there are a couple of different methods that work, or they aim to work more locally to restore the Arctic sea ice. I mean, during the winter, it's dark in the Arctic and the sea ice tends to regrow. And in the spring and summer, when the sun starts to heat locally on the sea ice, it melts again quite rapidly during these days. And that's why we're hitting the all-time record low in terms of sea ice extent yet again rise as temperatures are warming. So there's one method that aims to provide sort of artificial snow, if you like, on top of the sea ice. So it's about putting large amounts of tiny microbeads. So you can create this in China. I think today you have this production of tiny, so 35 micrometer hollow beads that would float in the sea ice, but also they could lie on top of the Arctic sea ice. So there's the same size as large pollen or dust that settles. So not the dust that just stays up in the atmosphere, but the one that sort of settles and lays down on the ground eventually. And that could be spread over the sea ice to make it more reflective. And then in that way promote more sea ice growth. But it's not yet clear, I would say, how that would affect things like marine mammals, ice algae, and phytoplankton, because we shouldn't really neglect the role of these really small scale processes in terms of the regional ecosystems and so on. And then you also have the London Convention, where it's illegal to dump stuff in the seas. And I'm not sure how that also plays in with regards to this method in specific. And there's also another method that has been proposed for restoring sea ice, and that's pumping seawater on top of the sea ice. So you're flooding the existing sea ice that you do have with the seawater, just to create thicker sea ice than you would otherwise in the winter time when it's very cold. So whatever water is on top of that would in theory freeze quite fast. I've yet to see if this could work in practice. The thermophysics of this is at this stage unclear to me, but maybe some smarter minds can explain it to me what potential it is to make this work in real life. And then you still need to keep in mind the biology and chemistry of the oceans too when you start these kind of interventions. So those are the two kind of sea ice promoting methods, and then you have another method proposed for preserving land ice, because of course you have a very important Greenland ice sheets, and it's losing a lot of mass. Yes, it's gaining some mass at the very top, but it's losing more mass than it's gaining overall. And one of the reasons is that it's in part of it's in contact with very warmer ocean currents. So in Jakobshavn, in that bay there, it's been suggested that you could build an underwater wall, and that would reduce the interaction with this warmer water and the land ice and the ice that is calming out into the fjord. And then that could help the land ice that is there to sort of reground onto the surface, so less of it would be carved out into the fjord there. But then again, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, this ice fjord. So in practice, I'm not sure how nature protection and the interpretation of that would be defined. So are we intervening, or are we protecting nature by building underwater walls? That's not clear to me either. But of course, that has been mentioned already. We have the permafrost as well, which is key in the global climate. I mean, when you start studying permafrost, it can emit a large amount of CO2 and methane. So it has also been suggested as by introducing different animals that can eat the bushes and shrubs that keep growing up with enhanced CO2 in the atmosphere. If you can introduce some animals that can eat these off, then you get a larger coverage of snow, which would reflect more sunlight and hence cool. And also, if they are stomping around, treading on the snow, it gets more compressed, which means you're changing the properties of the snow in terms of insulation. So in theory, the permafrost below the snow could get colder than it would otherwise without these animals. So these are the sort of local methods suggested, in addition to, of course, the more globally targeted ones that you touched upon earlier, Janos, with the stratospheric aerosols and the marine cloud brightening and so on, where you could cool globally and also the Arctic. Yeah. So it's a very long story, very short.
Oh, thank you. This is helpful. And then it was very interesting that you went into detail of the ones that are really local and that would be done in the Arctic for the Arctic. And then there are other things that one could do globally. So thank you very much for that. And we may come back to some of these issues. Now, I'd like to come to Shawna. And so far, we haven't spoken much about the people who live in the Arctic region. And maybe you could say a few words about that. How do the people living in the Arctic think about these issues that we're talking about? Is their knowledge being taken into account in the discussions that are being had? And have they been consulted? And has that had any impact? So issues like that, if you could say a few words, that would be really helpful. Over to you, Shawna.
Great, thank you so much. I just liked how in the beginning of the introductions, people were sharing, that they had 30+ year careers of fighting, to stop climate change unsuccessfully. And I can say that I've had a 20-year career fighting those who are failing to stop climate change in the environmental community, often because it's difficult for those folks to truly understand how to have relationships with Indigenous people. And when we do look at those nonprofit boards and staff members, you often do not find very many people of color, let alone Indigenous people. And so it becomes a difficult conversation to try to figure out how to teach those environmental nonprofits how to do that job. We have 229 federally recognized tribes here in the state of Alaska, which is nearly, it's over a third of the nation's tribes. We have 13 regional corporations under the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which were formed in 1971. And we have over 200 village corporations. We do have one reservation, Metlakatla, but the corporation system was formed because people in Alaska could see that the reservation system in the lower 48 was not working very well. And so instead they did create this corporate structure. And it is the full-time job of these corporations to figure out how to dig, drill, and dump on a daily basis, because the economic value of doing those things is their first job. So it tends to fall to the 229 tribes to look out for our people, our communities. I serve on my tribal council. Of course, we know Indigenous people are not a monolith, so I cannot speak for all Indigenous people or all people in the Arctic. But I would say that it is important for us to remember that unlearning is just as important as learning. And there are lots of things that we have to unlearn. Recently, with the coronavirus, we were told initially masks didn't work. And then we quickly had to unlearn that and recognize, okay, masks do work and we need to do that job. So looking at the way that the country is structured, especially the United States and the governments, also, the globe, we see a lot of the savior mentality. We see a lot of the, we need to save the sea ice, save the polar bears, save the, typically the people are on the bottom of that list. And then we're looking at carbon trading and sort of talking about how, we are interested in creating the sort of Ponzi scheme of carbon credits and turning that into its own type of stock market where the corporations get to make money, continue to get to make money on the destruction of the planet and the genocide of the Indigenous people, essentially. So I would just say that communities are largely unaware, I would say, of these issues, of this conversation in particular. It's one of the things that we as a nonprofit organization have been trying to get the word out on, is why I'm doing these talks, sharing this information back with my tribal council. But you have to also recognize that because of generational trauma and colonization and westernization, we have so many different problems facing us in our communities that this isn't one that is the first thing that we discuss at my tribal council. When I meet with my tribal council, we're talking about elders who have been sick and need to go to the hospital or need medication. We're talking about elders and young people that don't have housing, and we're trying to figure that out. We're talking about how to keep our children in our communities instead of having them adopted outside of our community. So we're talking about, drug and alcohol abuse. We're talking about, I'm a cancer survivor. We're talking about health issues. We don't usually sit down and just say, wow, this, this climate change issue is really at the forefront, especially this, solar modification stuff. That isn't what's being discussed. But I do know that when they spray DDT in South Africa, it only takes 10 days to reach the Arctic. And I worry that as we talk about, in particular, the little beads, silica beads, that because they're so tiny, maybe they won't have such a big effect. And I think, there's a lot of different things to look at, especially the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There's a lot of ways to figure out how to consult with tribes and to talk with Indigenous peoples on these issues. But I do worry that having the discussion about how tiny something is, may make it less harmful. The coronavirus is tiny, but it sure is making a big impact on all of us. And so I'll stop there. I'm sure I've just raised a whole host of issues. So there you go.
Thank you. And let's start not just the learning, but the unlearning of certain issues, very important. Okay, so I'd just like to, first of all, remind our participants to put their questions. Some are already happening, so that's good. We'll come to them in a moment. I'd like to put that aside for the moment. But in the meantime, I'd like to ask our guest speakers if they have any comments or questions to each other. If you're still thinking, I'd like to actually just get one issue going, because what I thought was quite interesting, Durwood, you mentioned about the next 10 years, and that the next 10 years is actually quite critical. And then the question that arises is that, is this the situation in which some quick acting solar radiation modification is part of the answer? As a question. So not just to you, but to the group as a whole. And then I hope that you have some questions to each other.
Well, I'll kick this off. Tim Lenton says, when you look at the feedbacks and the tipping points, we have 10 years maximum. He says it's between 0 and 10 years. So speed has to become one of our key metrics. We don't even measure the right things necessarily. So speed to avoided warming, not just billions of tons or gigatons, but because that doesn't tell you the impact you have on slowing warming. So it's speed to avoided warming, I'd say, key metric that we need. And then we need to convince, or to use Shawna's framing, teach the UNFCCC and COP26 to unlearn their obsession with just CO2 and their long, slow dance. The UNFCCC has said, they started 30 years ago. So in 30 years, what have we seen? Well, we have the Paris Agreement. Brad explains it's not sufficient for the Arctic, it's not sufficient for the world. And now the UNFCCC says, we are going to take 30 more years to get to 2050 net zero. Give us 30 more, okay? Because we did such a good job with the first 30. That's crazy. I mean, we need to take the other measures like Montreal. We need an Arctic agreement. Why do we not have not just a research effort to answer the questions that Sean is posing and Helen on the micro beads, but the solutions as well. Arctic Council is not the answer. It's way too wimpy. So I think we need the 10-year sprint. I think it needs to be all out. And again, I don't like solar radiation management, but I like failing with climate even less. So I think we need to be ready.
And any other, Brad?
Yeah, just to build on that, I think that we have a first order problem of a shared understanding of what the scale of this problem is. And I completely agree with Durwood that there is a broken system that continues to tell us that simply reducing emissions and doing it by 2050 is a pathway to a safe climate for us and our children and our grandchildren. And I think that the science does not bear that out. And so I think we've got a very significant job to do of changing the dialogue here. Getting, you know, people keep saying, well, I don't want you to scare people. If you scare people, they'll move into inaction. Well, I would say we're not really propelled into action right now, and a little bit of fear, at least among people who have self-appointed as leaders in this space, is necessary, because we really are running out of time. And just to, you know, on the science that we need, we've got tremendous science capacity in the Arctic. It might be one of the best regions in the world in terms of the amount of scientific capacity for many nations. There's almost nobody in that community looking at these questions. And the reason is because they're not on the agenda of the political elites, the economic elites, the intellectual elites, and others who guide the agendas for science. We've got to put this on the agenda. This has got to be a worthy topic of scientific inquiry, and it actually should be at the very top of our priorities of scientific inquiry. And so how do we do that? That's sort of a first order question that unlocks some of the work we then need to do.
Yeah, and you know what's so curious to me is that, you know, we're here discussing SRM, and some of us, we've been working on climate change issues for so many years now, and we've been pretty clear in our communication. And as you say, you know, we're approaching tipping points and we need to act now, and the next decade is so essential. So our decisions today really matter, right? In terms of, you know, the big decisions and the small ones. And, you know, it's pretty clear what the problem is. It's our continued dumping of CO2 into the atmosphere. And it's so frustrating because, you know, SRM won't fix that problem, right? So even though we're here discussing SRM, it's that sort of option plan D, right? Because yes, we need to cut our emissions, and we know this, and you know, we know that there's like there's a range of sort of top 8 companies that represent the big emissions out there. So basically we need to have this conversation with them, right? Stop the emissions. And we have been dumping so much emissions for such a long time into the atmosphere, so we need to clean that up, right? And if you look at the 1.5 degree report that you mentioned, David, then it's pretty clear that actually, if you're gonna call 1.5 degrees safe levels of climate change, which it might not be if you're looking at the heart of the Arctic, but still, in any scenario that gets you to 1.5 degrees, you need to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But still, if we were to cut all emissions today, which is of course not feasible, but still, that point in time when we cut all emissions, we would still today keep warming the climate because of all these lags within the climate system. So we would still need to adapt. So we still need mitigation, carbon dioxide removal, and adaptation. But even with that, yes, we still might have to discuss SRM, because we don't have the luxury, as far as I can see, to take that off of the table yet, even though it raises an enormous amount of issues that I think all the persons around the table have touched upon some of these issues. Then we just can't take that off of the table yet, as far as I can see, because climate change and how that affects the Arctic, both in terms of nature and peoples, it's so urgent.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you for putting this in the broader context of course, we need to do the emission reductions, and there is adaptation, and there's all these different things that have to come together. But if they're not coming together, then this conversation is very relevant. Now, I'd like to just quickly, Derwin?
Jump in.
Please go ahead.
Helen said something that is something I think we need to unlearn, which is we talk about CO2 emissions as the only problem. Yeah. And of course, there are a suite of climate pollutants beyond CO2. And while CO2 is the biggest, and if you look back historically, you say it represents perhaps 60% of all warming, let's focus on that. Then that makes perfect sense. That's what we've done. But when you look forward and say, what of the emissions will give us the fastest avoided warming, let's say at 2050, what you see is the non-CO2 short-lived climate pollutants give you up to 6 times more avoided warming than the most aggressive cuts to CO2 because of the persistence of CO2, for example. So understanding that, that second part, I think is really important. And of course, that's only one of the 3 things the 1.5 report told us. The other is carbon dioxide removal. Yes, we have to do that. You can also, at least in terms of physics and chemistry, remove methane from the atmosphere as well. And so that's something else we should be learning how to do. Anyway, so I just want to, it's one of the things that I wrestle with all the time. It's more than CO2, and the non-CO2 happens to be the fast path. As Brad was saying, if you don't pick the right path to net zero, you're going to lose the race way before. And the first sprinter, the 10-year sprint, has got to be successful to have a chance of getting to net zero 2050 and have a planet that can be saved.
Yeah, thank you, Durwood. And this is really good to remind ourselves about the time scale and the speed of different actions and the impacts, the time scale of the impacts of the different actions that one needs to undertake. Now, this is maybe another bad time to move in to start looking at some of the questions. And I'd like to start with the first one posed by Thibault Lamel, but I'd like to connect it with what Brad said. So first of all, Brad, you said that we need to get these things on the agenda. And then we've heard from Durwood that we have the Arctic Council, but it's not exactly the most effective. And part of the reason is that some of the important forces, political forces in that Arctic Council are exactly those that are very interested in the economic exploitation of the region. And maybe they're quite happy to have ice-free passage for their ships and so on and so forth. So, Thibault is asking, and I quote here, will the keen interest of many countries in the exploitation of natural resources of the Arctic, facilitated by the melting of sea ice, prevent any implementation of SRM methods in the Arctic? And it all comes together, the institutions that we have, the economic interests that are there, that are pushing in different ways. How do we get out of this? So any of you can respond to that?
I'll take a
Okay, Shawna, go ahead.
A first shot at it. I would just say, going back to my points about trying to understand this sort of savior mentality, and which is very much a Christian worldview way of looking at things. It's important for people to try to figure out how to decolonize, and you start that by starting with yourself and decolonizing your mind to try to understand what does it mean. And when I talk about that, I'm really referring to the relationship with the earth that each of us have as individuals. And I think about all of the scientific terms and the legal terms that we're using here. And I just want to mention and remind all of you that there's no way to say any of those words in my traditional language. But in 10,000 years that my people have been here, there was never a need to say those words, because we had a full understanding that it was not our job to control the climate or control the policies or control how the earth was responding. We were we were under the control of the earth. The earth controlled us. The earth told us when, you know, the moon cycles were changing, when to pick the berries, when to, you know, do all of the things that we needed to do in that type of relationship that we have. And I was in my young 20s working with an elder, and, you know, sometimes this work can be really daunting. It can be really exhausting emotionally and spiritually for us who are, because this is really a spiritual battle for us as Indigenous people. And for me, I would say in particular, I was so exhausted, and he saw that in me, and he came and he said, you know, don't worry, don't worry. He said, we've been here for thousands and thousands of years, and we're not going anywhere. He said, when you start feeling that way, just relax, because the people on the planet who don't understand the original instructions and that we are not in control, that the earth does not need us, but we need the earth, they will eventually destroy themselves, but we will still be here. And so it was a very harsh thing to say, but I do think that unless we stop trying to think about it in terms of saving the planet and start thinking about it as in terms of how do we save ourselves? How do we save ourselves and our relationship that we have with the earth? And not only our relationship, but our responsibility. Thinking about it in that way is really going to be the only way to decolonize, as well as things like including Arctic people and advocacy about Arctic lands, waters, and wildlife, and whose survival depends on that, on their protections, including local organizing from local people as critical strategy, including be curious and don't assume, clarify roles, representations, and also making an effort to meaningfully ally visions and support just and equitable resource sharing amongst amongst people around the world. I think as long as we continue to think about it in an individualistic way, I think we're still going to continue to have these problems.
Thank you, Shawna. That's a very interesting perspective, and it's good to hear you saying these things. Do you, any other colleagues would like to respond? Derwent?
Just a quick reminder that Einstein said the definition of insanity is to continue to do the same thing over and over and expect different results.
Yeah, thank you for reminding us of that one.
Good reminder, and of course that's what the UNFCCC is doing, and the comment about carbon trading as a Ponzi scheme is also a good insight here. But you raised questions, Shawna and Janos, about how deep does the revolution have to be to keep the planet habitable, to save ourselves, however we want to frame this. And is it sufficient simply to tinker with the economic system, and internalize cost and do trading? That is not going to be sufficient given the emergency we're in, if it ever would be sufficient. So we started climate, thinking perhaps that it was an environmental problem and that it was a long-term problem, 100 years. Now, of course, we see it's a very near-term problem, and it's not an environmental problem. Environmental ministers are the weakest ministers in a cabinet. They don't have the power to correctly address and resolve climate change. Foreign affairs ministers, they're a little better, economic ministers, energy ministers, defense ministers. But ultimately, we need to push this issue into heads of state. And I think this is something we would expect future President Biden and Vice President Harris to do, and to reconstitute the Major Economies Forum and bring this emergency to the heads of government. They're the only ones who can see the folly of investing in the Arctic, where you'll strand your assets. They have to have the broad view. So I see this, and I predict, but I'm also an advocate for moving this to heads of government.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry if I interrupted you,
ahead, yeah.
but it's interesting how you present it, or that's investing in stranded assets in the Arctic, because of course I live in Norway and we've been exploring petroleum resources within the Arctic and going northwards and northwards gradually, right? And becoming very rich and wealthy and happy from that, until we're now sitting here facing, the very rapid consequences of climate change, considering, well, we are close to the Arctic, and as I said, Janos, at the start, we're warming, or, the impacts of climate change are 2 to 3 times as fast and strong here, right? So now we're considering, maybe exploring more and more northwards for petroleum resources isn't such a good idea after all. But that, yet again, we're seeing that some of our neighboring countries who didn't have that, initial hot start on the petroleum are moving in that direction and are wanting to go in that direction. And then I'm wondering, who are we to sit here in our position and say, no, you shouldn't go out and do that, because, well, we've already made ourselves rich and fat from this and our money, and emitted our CO2 so much so that you shouldn't have the right to go out and do that. So, in terms of geopolitics, it's already actually quite complicated, within the Arctic, I would say, when it comes to these kind of issues. There are so many different interests and stakeholders. Petroleum activity is one of the things. And another thing is, of course, shipping, which I'm working with. And I have to say, I'm quite grateful that some of the industry partners, or most of all of them actually, that I work with in Norway, they see the issue of climate change, right? So they want to go green, they want to cut their own emissions because climate change is an issue. So they're not saying, oh, open sea ice, I can just send more ships through the northeastern seaway, right? So if you travel from Asia, say China, to Rotterdam or any port in Europe, if you go through the northeastern seaway along the Russian coastline instead of through the Suez Canal, you can maybe save 30 to 40% of your emissions. So you're saving money on spending, you're spending less money on fuels, and you're emitting less in terms of CO2, and also those short-lived climate forces that David has mentioned. But is that a good idea? Because actually, where you emit all these different species actually makes a difference as well. So, and if going through open sea through the Arctic means even more activity, then that's just not good news permanently, right? Like there's so many different issues when it comes to just geopolitics of climate change, and then when you add SRM on top of it, then it's this hot mess. I don't even know where to start. So I'm glad we're more sitting around this campfire this evening.
Around the campfire, we can do all kinds of things. But just you've raised a couple of interesting points here, Helen. I want to come to Gary Hughes's question, which also received 2 likes here. Very simple question: should there be a moratorium on oil and gas exploration and extraction in the Arctic?
And pretty much everywhere else too.
Well,
yes,
I mean, seriously, if we're going to be honest about the problem we face, we should be moving away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And any additional government subsidy of fossil fuel exploration is, or support for it really has to be the first test of how serious we are in facing this problem. So absolutely to the Arctic and to most of the rest of the world.
There's an effort that we're participating in from my NGO called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So, I mean, this is, it's a good analogy to the weapons systems, because we're going to destroy ourselves in the same way. And it sounds radical at first, and with a little more thought, it sounds completely sensible. We have enough fossil fuel already to fry the world, boil the world, whatever your favorite cooking technique is, we're going to lose it. So we should at least put out of bounds the most fragile ecosystems, or those with feedbacks and tipping points. So the Arctic, is number one. Amazon may be a close number two. We've lost 17% of the Amazon. The tipping point, when we turn it all into a savanna, is between 20 and 40%. Now the scientists say closer to 20 to 25%. So in other words, we could be 3% away from destroying enough of the Amazon to turn it into a savanna and lose the great sink and the weather system for Latin America. So we're, yes, fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. We all need to sign up.
Okay. I just want to follow up quickly on something you just said, Derwood, which there's also a question in this relation from Aldis Elfarsdottir about tipping points. You know, we've been talking about tipping points that being very close or we've just gone by, and the question is whether it could be a sort of a numbing in the public discourse, that if we've already crossed them and people haven't been feeling the effects, and then the whole argument might be lost. Is this, what do we do with this?
Well, I agree with Brad that you know, you have to tell the truth. I like the new framing in this new wonderful book called All We Can Save. You know, truth, courage, and solutions for the climate crisis. All women writers. Women may be the ones who save the planet. And Shawna, I'm going to have to work on my language here, but I'm using the shorthand of save us all for the moment, or keep us all in a zone that we can continue to live and prosper. So
maybe just to add to that, Derwood, I don't think it's going to be a collective effort that saves us all. It never is, right? There's going to be 40% of the population that believe the Earth is 10,000 years old and are never going to participate really effectively in this discussion. There's going to be, it's not going to be a mass collection of humanity. It's going to be a group of individuals, and I would say the private sector is going to have to play a very significant role here as well, because governments move too slow. And while the private sector has indeed failed us many times in the past, they've also brought to scale many things that have made our world a better place. And scaling up things like carbon dioxide removal and greenhouse gas removal, I don't see it happening very quickly through governmental pathways, but I do think you see commitments from big corporations around the world, led by Microsoft, with a negative carbon commitment to clean up their entire carbon footprint. That goes beyond anything any government has said. And they're actually backing it with the research and development money that's going to be needed. So, we're going to need the people who are in a position to do something to be activated and to get moving, and the rest of the world hopefully will follow, but we can't wait for that.
Yeah.
I do also really think that raises an interesting question to talk about corporations and thinking about how, so many people in the United States think that we live in a democracy, which obviously we know we do not. We understand that corporations are being recognized as people and have in some ways more power, which is very interesting for you to raise, because what you're saying is because corporations have so much more power and authority, they're faster and quicker than governments can ever be, have more resources, and we need to rely on them. Yet when we're looking at the extraction industries, we're talking about, it just becomes sort of an oxymoron to try to figure out how do we rely on these oil and gas industries to, stop trying to generate revenue for their shareholders. My mother-in-law was one of the many architects for the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People. And she's been doing that for, 35 years. She's got some key lessons that I always take with me everywhere. The first one is, you don't know how bad you want something until you know what you're willing to give up to get it. You don't know how bad you want something until you know what you're willing to give up to get it. She always tells me, don't do other people's organizing. Because I've been an organizer for years. She says, don't do other people's organizing. She says, don't accept responsibility where you have no authority. And the last thing she says is a joke. She always tells this funny little joke about what's the difference between being involved and committed, because she talks about how we as Indigenous people we're committed. We're not just involved in this process. We're committed because we're part of this ecosystem. We're interdependent with all the things that we're interacting with here. And she says, you know, what's the difference between, you know, in terms of being involved and committed? She said, it's like a ham and egg breakfast. She says, you know, the chicken is involved and the pig is committed. And so trying to think about it, whether you're just involved or whether you're truly committed, and trying to figure out how to apply these things and move forward while decolonizing ourselves and our children, as well as, you know, helping folks to understand that this is not a democracy, and that we're going to have to figure out how to make these kinds of changes.
I just want to add one thing to what I said, Janos, which is not that I like this outcome, that corporations are more agile and powerful in many ways than governments. I don't like it at all. I don't like the fact that we're even talking about modifying solar radiation. I don't like the fact that we're talking about the possibility of the planet becoming uninhabitable. I don't like any of that. But that said, we have to work from the situation that we're in. Not wish it were other. We can work to make it other, but wishing it were other won't get us very far along the solution here.
Yeah, we don't exactly live in a perfect world. And so we have to deal with that as it is. Can I just shift to two questions, two sets of questions that have come from our participants that I think are quite interesting and maybe linked to some of what has been said. On the one hand, we have Silvia Ribeiro asking, and I think she had one or two likes on her question, that if the richer people in the world would change their lifestyle, that would reduce emissions, and wouldn't be better if we talk about that as opposed to risky options like geoengineering. At the same time, another set of questions here, we have, I think it was Peter Wadhams has asked that wouldn't the panel agree that the extremely long residence time of CO2 makes emission reduction by itself essentially pointless, with no possibility of achieving climate cooling? Therefore, shouldn't the emphasis be on carbon removal? So two very different aspects, but still it's about the same package of issues. How do we move forward on this? Any thoughts from your different perspectives, perhaps? Helen, you have a first go.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, these are good and very challenging questions, of course. But it's not a surprise. We know that it's very unequal in terms of emitters and in terms of those who are experiencing climate change the worst, right? So some people suffer unequally a lot more than those who are responsible for emissions, and that is something that I feel that we've been talking about for quite a long time, that you have a few, you know, the richest in terms of private persons and also in terms of companies. So you have states, companies and private people who emit the most. And we have been trying to get this across, right, that these sectors, persons, companies, they need to emit a lot less. But I mean, how do you do that, right? We sit there, we talk to them, and how do you get them to look up from their shoes, look in the eyes, and say, yes, I feel responsible? It's not straightforward. We're talking a lot, and yet nothing is happening. But yes, again, it would be a lot more responsible and safer for all of us if you could get those emissions down. And with regards to the other questions, yes, we need to cut emissions. Yes, we need to remove CO2, and yes, we need to adapt. And then yes or no to SRM, it's very unclear at this stage. To provide a very short but not an obvious answer to that question, because these are difficult conversations, a very difficult problem. Cut emissions, yes, that's what we need to do, and we need more.
So I'll add a couple of things.
Please.
Janos, you know, let's go back to Shawna's comments. And Shawna, I think next time we're going to have to invite your mother-in-law as well.
We can do that.
The youth movement is one of the brightest changes, and maybe there's less to unlearn when you're young and you haven't developed all of your bad habits yet. So you're seeing things like vegetarianism, beyond meat. You know, these are things that if you would have asked someone my age 10, 20 years ago, you know, would we have a meat substitute that was as good as a regular hamburger? You know, we could hardly imagine it, but now that's what we have. Electric vehicles also. I mean, and again, they're not environmental free, because they're still a vehicle. You have to extract the resources to build the damn things, including the batteries. But we see a lot of bright pieces. They're just not they're not sufficiently focused to change the world as fast as we need. But there are things to build on. So I think the cultural change is possible, and the deeper change that Shawna and Brad have mentioned that we do need to aim for, but we can't wait for. So we have to make progress in the meantime. And then Peter's comment about the persistence of CO2. Well, this is one of the great challenges, but we do know from Jim Hansen's 350 paper, how quickly you slow CO2 emissions, how quickly you remove carbon dioxide. And it's not quickly. The goal is, the better goal is 500 to 1,000 trillion tons, 500 to a trillion tons by the end of the century. So yes, we do need to learn how to do that. But again, I would propose that we think of this more like a relay race. So you have to win the first sprint, the 10-year sprint, to stay in the race, and then you have to do carbon neutral, and net zero is really not the right target. It's real zero, in 2050. And then finally, you do have to learn how to take CO2 and methane out of the atmosphere far, far faster than the natural cycle.
Right.
Just one more thing. To use an analogy from the time we live in right now with COVID, right? The vaccine for this is true zero, okay? The vaccine for the climate crisis is true zero on cleaning up the carbon and methane and other pollutants we put in the atmosphere, restoring the climate. It's going to be a long time to get to that vaccine. So in the meantime, we also need different therapies, right? And that help us as we're sick. And ultimately, SRM is like the ventilator, potentially. You don't want to go on a ventilator. Nobody wants to go on a ventilator. But if the choice is between dying and going on a ventilator, I'm guessing that every single human would take the ventilator option. But we don't have the ventilator built. We don't even have it designed. We don't even know what it looks like at this point. And SRM fits in that category. It is not a good, it's the worst possible solution except for the alternative, right? And the alternative, only if we get to that point, is worse than actually potentially trying to save ourselves, save the planet, save all the other innocent fellow travelers on this planet. We've only talked about humans today. We're being pretty human-centric. There's a lot of other species and life forms that exist on this planet as well. So we should be, as part of our response, accelerating the research to understand whether we can even do these things. and whether they would have any impact. We don't understand enough of the interactions in the systems to know whether SRM will even work, and we're not investing any money to really try and find out. And if there's one takeaway from today, I hope it's that we could all agree that science and knowledge is a powerful tool. We should not walk away from it. This may be something we need. Let's invest in it.
Also, I would just like to add, you know, talking about traditional ecological knowledge and traditional ways of knowing, and just understanding that, you know, although I do appreciate the analogy of, you know, needing the technology, I don't think that Indigenous people should have to be the guinea pig. And, you know, that is what typically ends up happening in scenarios like this, because somehow through global history, Indigenous people have been thought to be dispensable, and it is usually at our expense. We're already the poorest communities. We already have the highest rates of incarceration. We already have the highest rates of cancer. We already have the, you know, you name it, we've got it. We've got the highest rates of alcoholism, drug addiction, you know, all these different things. But on the other hand, Indigenous people also have traditional knowledge. And I would say that until the scientific community and really the world starts understanding that we as Indigenous people have been given original instructions and we know how to take care of our area, you know, the people that live closest, the people who live closest to the problem are usually the people who will be closest to the solutions themselves. And so until we're inviting Indigenous people and tribal members to the table to have these conversations at a governmental level and at an industry level, we're going to continue, I think, to operate in this circle scenario.
I'd like to actually go back to you, Shawna, with a question, because you've raised this a couple of times in different ways, but we have these big things we've been talking about, technologies and words and approaches, SRM, and then you talked about the difficulty of even saying those things in some of the languages of the local people. Yet there is such a thing as prior informed consent, which I think you would want to pursue. So how does one achieve that when we have such, you know, even the words, the phrases don't necessarily mean anything? How do you do that in the particular context of the Arctic?
Yeah, you know, as I mentioned, my mother-in-law was one of the chief architects of the UN UNDRIP, as we say, and she always likes to say, you know, that the declaration is the floor, it's not the ceiling. And so really thinking about, you know, free, prior, informed consent, that is a very important part of what needs to happen, because it should be, as, you know, as sovereign entities, it should be our right to decide, you know, how we would like to participate in, you know, in these kinds of discussions. But also, I would just say, having a better understanding of it's you know, I like to tell stories. And I'm always trying to think how I could explain things differently to make other people understand what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. I'm always trying to think about these things, and these are things that my ancestors and my elders have been saying for many, many years. And, you know, I recognize that it's easy for us to say that, you know, these are large problems and, you know, there are so many different issues tied to them. But I think, you know, that until we start looking at just transitions and really thinking about how do we start moving away from the fossil fuels, how do we start consulting with communities about what different kinds of economic systems that were in place before, because we had economies in Alaska as tribal nations before Westernization set foot and came into our area, and Russia for that matter. We had salmon economies, we had trade economies, we had all different kinds of economies. And until people can really unlearn, there's all this unlearning to do. Until we can unlearn, this will continue to be the discussion.
Well, thank you. We're getting close to the end, and I would like to ask one question from all of you, if you have thoughts on it. But in the end, we need to be pragmatic. We need governance frameworks that will move us forward somehow, however it is done and whoever is involved, whether the private sector should be involved in that governance mechanism, whether or to what extent the local inhabitants, the indigenous people should be involved. But what would work at a pragmatic level in the Arctic? We've heard words about the Arctic Council, we heard words about the Montreal Protocol. Would these be potential vehicles, or is there something else? Should we get Microsoft to organize it? Whatever is the way to do it. And any pragmatic thoughts in the last couple of minutes that we have left?
I'll start with the Montreal Protocols. I mentioned the best treaty we've ever created for environmental protection, including for climate. So we have to ask, what more could this treaty do? And the first thing you would say is, let's put N2O in, because it's the last unregulated ozone depleter and climate pollutant. So that's a big step we could take. But we could also say to the Montreal Protocol, if there's going to be sulfates put into the atmosphere, which risk destroying stratospheric ozone, that should be regulated by the Montreal Protocol. Okay? So that's a governance mechanism operating for 33 years with tremendous success, universal participation. Every UN country is a member. Every UN country participates and has been almost completely in compliance. There have been a few exceptions, but very, very high compliance. So that's a muscular treaty we should maximize its participation. The second would be moving the issue to heads of government. Several governments have said, we recognize that we're in a climate emergency, but they really don't know what that means. I mean, that's a political phrase, and we need a true heads of state group that recognizes the climate emergency and develops the plan for responding to the emergency. If we don't win, it's back to the analogies of health. I mean, if this is triage, save what we can, and if we don't do the 10-year heroic effort to slow down the warming, the feedbacks will take over and the tipping points will be passed, and we'll face a world that will lead to climate chaos that'll again overwhelm the governance system. So that's my second recommendation, up to the heads of state. And of course, we haven't been able to do that in the United States the last 4 years minus a week today. And we will be able to with the new administration. And we know that Joe Biden has made this a priority. So,
okay. We have just 1 minute left. So Shawna, Helen, Brad, if you have any quick thoughts on the overall governance at this stage.
I'll just try to say very quickly, I work in an organization that's a woman-led organization and a youth-led organization. I'm actually the oldest person in my organization. And I'm happy to be led by the youth, and I'm learning so much from them. And I really want to just leave with a question and a request, which is, why is it not pragmatic to decolonize your mind? And why is it not pragmatic to immediately moving to just transition? If we can globally adjust to a virus as fast as we have, why is it not pragmatic? And the last, the request I leave you with is just to continue to try to unlearn all these things that we have convinced ourselves that we have to be pragmatic and to decolonize our minds and our practices.
Thank you. Ellen, Brad, any last thoughts? 20 seconds.
Very quickly, I think we need to learn from what we are experiencing. So with the existing protocols, adopt from them. Climate change is happening so fast, so we need to keep learning. And when it comes to SRM, I think we need some creative thinking and identify some new principles. And basically, we need as many voices around the table as possible, with as many stakeholders present as well.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid our time has come to an end. As always, we need more time, but thank you so much for your thoughts and ideas. This is a complex challenge, but we have to rise to it and save ourselves and save the Arctic. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.